I'm going to do a freestyle photo edit inside of Luminar Neo so that you guys can follow along, get to see my thought process and see what tools I throw at the photo to improve its overall look and quality. Currently I don't even have a plan for the photo edit. I just know that the image I captured on camera in no way represented what I was seeing with my eye and what drew me to actually take that photo in the first place. So you guys get to come along with me on this photographic editing journey, and you'll get to step inside my thought process and see what tools I apply in Luminar Neo to actually achieve a finished result. And let's see what we come up with. So I took a trip down to the Catlins in New Zealand, and I still have a whole folder of images that I captured that still remain completely unedited, and they were taken back in 2020, as you can see up here in the info box, so I really need to catch up on these. And so this is 𝗨𝗶𝗪 Point Lighthouse, which I took with a very long 57-second exposure, as you can see here. And I had a neutral density filter over my camera because I just wanted to soften the clouds and hopefully get a bit of movement in them as well. So the first step I'd recommend of any photo edit is not something you can do in the computer, rather you can do it with your eyes and your mind, and that is just to analyze the image, see what flaws the photo has, see what potential it might have, and start to think about what you actually want to do and achieve with that photo. And the main thing that I'm seeing here with this photo is we have a very high contrast differential between the sky and the foreground. Looking at the foreground on my screen, it pretty much looks black. We also have our hero of the shot, the lighthouse, dead center in frame, but it's also surrounded by the most interesting part of the clouds here. So I really want to make this area here the feature, but I also have quite a lot of work to do with the foreground as well. And so you will have seen in a lot of my videos, the first thing I like to do is expose the photo properly. So to start with, we might want to just boost the exposure up slightly, pull the highlights down so that we're protecting this area in the sky here. And we certainly want to grab the shadows here. And now all of a sudden we can see the foreground, we can see what we're dealing with. And if we look at our histogram here, we're much closer to having a full tonal range. That's a very logical and practical way to start any edit. However, I'm going to show you guys a slightly different approach for this particular photo, because I keep getting asked the same question: can the HDR merge tool be used for a single frame? Click merge, and while Luminar works its magic on that file for us, I'm going to say yes, absolutely, you can use it on a single image to bring out more dynamic range, and that's going to save you having to mess around with the highlights and the shadows and make those adjustments yourself. Using the HDR merge tool can give you a quick boost into releasing some of that high dynamic range that may be there in the raw file that you're perhaps not seeing when you first load your photo. So that's what we've done here. And here we go, we now have an HDR merge version which has been dropped into the HDR merge folder by Luminar, and now we can go to work onto this. And as you can see, we've got a lot more information in the foreground that we're able to work with. We've got more detail on the lighthouse, and we've also introduced some richer colors and detail into the sky as well. So let's make a start on this. I can still go into the develop tool here and still make those adjustments so that I can fine tune things just the way I want them. I'm still going to bring up those shadows just ever so slightly and toggle the eye tool before and after. And this is kind of giving us the best of both worlds in terms of controlling the overall brightness values, the highlights, the shadows, but we're also able to benefit from that added detail that the HDR merge tool has given us. And now as I've zoomed in, I've noticed the image isn't as sharp as I'd like, possibly because I had the neutral density filter over the top of my lens, but regardless, it's not as sharp as I would like. So I'm just going to use the sharpness tool inside of the develop tool here. And I'm also going to bump in just a little bit of luminosity noise reduction, because as I'm adding that sharpness, that long exposure noise is evident. So I feel like things are looking pretty good, but the foreground is still significantly darker than the sky. So what I could do to actually fix that is look at the Relight AI tool, because we have the brightness near slider, which is actually going to just brighten up that foreground element for us. And we have the brightness far slider as well, so that we could brighten up or darken down the sky. But in this instance, I think I just want to concern myself with this foreground element here. And now I can grab the depth slider just to decide how far back I actually want to push this lighting. So I'm going to be quite aggressive and push that quite far towards the lighthouse. And by revealing the detail in the foreground, rather than just the lighthouse being our main character in this photo and the clouds behind, we now have quite a few central elements going on. We've got the 𝗨𝗪𝗪 area here. We've now revealed this track as well, the lighthouse and the clouds. So in terms of composition and visual weight, we are very strong, we're very emphasized through the center of the frame, and I like that. So we've kind of split the photo into different zones. So we have a left and a right with less interest, and we have a central component which is much more visually interesting. And then we also have that top-bottom split as well. So by giving our composition a bit of thought during the editing process, hopefully we've given our viewer something more interesting to look at than what was originally there, which was very much a dichotomy of a dark, bright 50-50 split, which, as you guys know, who know anything about composition, normally you do not want to put your horizon line straight through the middle. However, for this particular photo, when I framed it, I knew that the lighthouse was the key point and I wanted it in the center of the frame. And so that rule of put your horizon line on the bottom third, top 2/3, whatever, that kind of went out the window. And so with composition, it's usually guides, not hard and fast rules. So I'm pretty happy with how it's looking now with that visual weight that I referenced before. So the next thing I'd like to do is something I'll often do with skies, and that is create a kind of light sandwich, i.e. I'm making the brightest part of the photo more towards the center of the frame and the darker parts the top and the bottom. So currently we have a dark foreground, we have a brighter part through the middle, but we also have brightness at the top, and your viewer's eye will always go to the brightest part of the frame. And so currently the viewer's eye is kind of drifting off out of the frame. So what I'm going to do is just jump into the develop tool, and the easiest way to darken things down is just to grab the exposure slider and bring that down. You can do other methods if you want, but we'll go with that for this one. Highlights, bring that down as well. And now all we need to do is grab a mask and just drop in a linear gradient. So effectively we're going to have 100% of that effect at the top, and it's just going to taper off to where I let go at the bottom here. And so if I jump back into the adjustments and toggle the before and after, we can see that we have indeed darkened down the top of the sky. Now it is going over the lighthouse, but because it's done with a bit of feathering from 100 to 0, it's a natural transition. It doesn't bother me too much, but if it did, and if AI masking is working properly, what we could do is come in and click that. And once Luminar Neo has identified the elements, we have the option of selecting architecture. And if you click it once, obviously it's going to select architecture. You click it again and it's actually going to remove it. So it's taking the lighthouse away from the sky. But unfortunately, as you can see, it's not done a very good job there at all. So I'm just going to press Ctrl-Z on my keyboard twice and set that back to how it was. The next thing I'd like to do is have a play with the Structure AI tool. And my method for most tools is just to grab the amount slider and push it all the way to 100, so things get pretty gnarly pretty quickly, but it's really easy to identify and see exactly what's going on in your image. And then it's easy to make a call, where might I actually want to apply some of this effect. And so I'm looking at the grasses, I'm looking at the center of the frame, and I'm looking at this track here, thinking, yeah, for sure, I might want some of that in there. Probably not on the lighthouse, it's been a little too aggressive and accentuating probably the worst of the lighthouse, not the good bits, but I like what it's doing in the sky up here with the clouds. So before and after, so we could paint a little bit in there. So I'm going to jump into the masking section, come to my brush, make sure that we have our softness set to 100. You never want to be working with a hard edge brush when you're working on this sort of thing. And strength, I rarely want to set that too high. So now wherever I click and start painting, I'm going to have 28% of this effect. And so that is exactly what I'm going to do. Start painting this in through the tussock region through there. Maybe a little bit on the sides. And I was also liking it up in the clouds as well up there. And if we want to double down on any areas like the track, we might want to accentuate even further. We can just stroke over that one more time, maybe even twice. And these little tussocks here. And then I always have a little toggle of my before and after, and just check if I'm happy with what I've done. And if you feel like you've gone too heavy-handed, which I do here, I just flip back to the arrays and let's have a little paint out of that and see how this looks. Perhaps it was a little bit too heavy-handed up in the sky, so I'll just take that back just a little bit. And again, toggle my before and after. Okay, I think that's achieving what I was after while still remaining fairly subtle. However, if later in the review process I decide that, you know what, that was just a little too heavy-handed, I can always jump into the edit section, revisit that tool and just tone it back slightly, and then all the other tools that are sitting on top of that edit will just update accordingly. So that's a really nice feature with inside Luminar Neo, and I do that a lot. So the next thing I'm going to try is working with curves to bring in just a little bit more contrast and interest to that central area of the photo, and perhaps even dial back the contrast around around the edges as well. Let's see how that turns out. So I'm going to open up the develop tool because curves exists as a sub-tool within that. And as you guys know, if we bring the line up at all, it's going to brighten the area up. And if we bring it down, things get darker. So we can subjectively control specific areas of our photo. So what I'd like to do is actually just brighten up this center point of the frame here. I don't want to go too far because I don't want to actually bleach out the color that I have in the clouds at the moment. So I'm just going to do that quite subtly at the moment. And I'm going to darken down the shadows as well. I've just put another point just slightly higher there because that allows me to talk directly into the shadows only without affecting these midtones. So I'm just bringing that down, making sure we still have a nice amount of contrast. And now all I need to do is mask it through the center of the frame here. So I'll jump into masking. Yes, I could brush this in, but in this instance, I'm going to use a radial gradient because that's nice and easy to achieve our effect. So currently, if I flip out of the masking mode and we look at our before and after, we've got the opposite of what we want. We're actually brightening the extremities of the frame. So if we jump into the masking section again and come back here to the mask actions, if I actually show the mask, we can see what we're dealing with. Well, we have the option to invert that mask. And so now we're going to be brightening or introducing that curve that we just made into the center of the frame. So let's have a look at that. Here's our before, here's our after, before and after. And if we want to make adjustments to the outside of the frame, quite precisely based on what we have here, we can actually borrow from this mask and use the inversion of it. So it'll give us the opposite of what we currently have now. So I'm going to close that tool down, open another instance of develop, come into masking, and I'm going to paste the mask that we just had there. So if I show, we now have that mask applied to a brand new instance of develop. I'm going to invert it so that we're just talking into the outside of the frame or the opposite of what we just edited. And now when I come into my adjustments, any changes I make are only being applied to the outside part of that frame. And I think all I'm going to do is just make sure that we don't have any highlights peeking around the edge of the frame. And perhaps I'm actually just going to boost up the shadows just ever so slightly so it's still dark, but we've reduced the contrast around the outside. So if we look at our before and after, it's still darkening around the outside, but the contrast is now less. And now I'm going to move on to working with the color in the photo. So normally I like to approach my processing in the following way. I'll do the luminosity first, i.e. the brightness values, the contrast. That will be the first thing I'll address in the photo. Get that exposure locked in, get those highlights and the shadows just how I want them. Then if there's certain areas that I want to bring attention to, as there was in this, I use structure AI. You can also use the dodge and burn tool to brighten and darken areas. The second thing I'll address is the color. Not strictly true. I said this is a freestyle edit. It's also a freestyle video, so bear with me. I will also address the color balance that the camera naturally thinks is what is appropriate for the shot. If I'm happy with it, I'll leave it alone, but I'll normally give that just a subtle move on the white balance inside the develop tool as my initial step, but that's all I'll be doing with color at that stage. More specific things like the green in the foreground here, I find that just a little obnoxious, a little bit of a toxic green. I will address that after step one. So the next thing we're going to do is color, and then the third thing are the more creative adjustments that I might be making to my photo. So let's look at color and see what we can do. So one of the first things I like to do when I'm working with color is to actually increase the saturation, like really boost this up, 100%, and now we can see much more clearly what colors we're actually dealing with. So we can see we've got a lot of blues in the top right quarter of the frame, the bottom half is very green, and then we've got orange and kind of bluey magenta almost in the top left. So currently I'm a little bit bugged by the fact that this green is very just toxic green, doesn't really sit in with the color palette. I prefer to have a limited color palette rather than throwing every color of the rainbow at your photo. And so what I'm going to do is actually try and talk into these greens here using the HSL, which is going to allow me to change specific hues. So if I grab the green slider and start pushing that to the left, it's going to take that green more towards the yellow color range. We can do the same with the yellows as well and push those more into an orangey color. So I'm going to do just a little bit of that and maybe even grab the cyans and just have a little toggle of those, see what that's doing. And we can also jump into the saturation and grab the green saturation and bring that down. So if I take that all the way to the left, you can see that we can completely desaturate that green, which isn't really what we're after, but I certainly don't want it quite as vibrant as what I had it before. Now obviously I don't want the saturation left as strong as 100%, but if I double click to reset it, you can see that the original photo is borderline monotone, so I certainly do want to increase that saturation by quite a lot. And I can even grab the vibrant slider and just see what that's doing for us. And we can just have a toggle of our before and our after. And now while I like what we've done to the landscape and the sky, I don't like the blue that has been accentuated in the lighthouse here. It's a little bit fake looking. So what I think I will do is close that color palette down, open up another color tool, and this time I'm going to specifically talk into the blues by grabbing the saturation slider and just pulling that blue out. So now you can see that we've removed all the blue from the photo, but obviously I don't want to remove it from the lovely richness in the sky. I just want to take it away from the lighthouse. And because we still have our mask AI, we can just click the architecture button and it should be able to identify that straight away. But as you can see, it's not perfect. So what we could do is just come in and refine that with the brush, but to be honest, I'm really not happy with how this is looking, so we'll just kill that by coming into the mask actions and choosing clear, and I'm just going to use our brush again. And this time I'm just going to bring the size of the brush down a little bit and also just harden up the edges just a tad. And now I can click and paint over the lighthouse, and each time I paint over it with a subsequent pass, it's just going to introduce the underline tool, which is a graying of the previously blue lighthouse. So there you go. We now have a much more color accurate lighthouse, it was neutral. Let's zoom out and have a little look. And if we press our / key, we can see the original HDR merge that Luminar gave us, and I release, and we can see where we're at the moment. So here's our before, here's our after. I'll be honest, I'm not really happy with how this is looking at the moment. So while I'm a big proponent of having a plan of action when you're attacking your photos and having an idea of what tools you're going to use to achieve those results, but on this occasion I'm not quite sure where to go with this. And so what I am going to do here is just dive into some of Luminar Neo's tools, push them all the way to 100, have a look at what effect it's doing to the photo. Do I like it? Do I not? If I do like it, where do I want to apply that effect? And just see whether I can't use Luminar Neo to actually spark a little bit of creative enlightenment for this one. So let's see. Okay, before I move on to the creative section, which I love, well, there's one tool I would like to visit first, and that is the landscape tool. So I'm going to explore the dehaze slider and just see what that's doing for me. And as I look at the photo, the first thing I actually notice and stands out to me as I toggle the before and after is that we're actually introducing some of that lovely orange toning to the right of the lighthouse here. So before and after, but most of the image is being overcooked with this effect, so I may be able to mask in some of that around there. I'll double click to reset it, and now I'm going to explore the golden hour slider as well. And again, I'm toggling my before and after of that tool, and I do quite like what it's doing to the sunrise here. Again, 100% is too much, so I'm just going to ease that back to where I want it. And I think I'm going to work with two different instances of this landscape tool. Reason being, I want to separate dehaze and golden hour and work with them separately. So I'm going to jump into the masking section so that I can first apply the golden hour filter. And I'm just going to paint that in through here. Just start introducing that to the sky on this left hand side here, just increasing that orange intensity. And I also quite liked what it was doing to the grass area here as well. Let's have a little look where we came from and where we've got to. It's pretty subtle, but it's okay. I'll close the tool down, open a new instance, and now we can work with the dehaze. And as I crank that up, we can start to see that orangey effect appear in the cloud here. So I'm just going to grab the masking tool again, go into brush mode, and I'm just going to paint some of that in through the sky here. And my brush needs to be a little softer than that for my liking. But the problem dehaze has for me is it's just darkening down those shadows a little bit too much. So I'll just switch to the erase mode and make sure that we don't have too much bleed over the shadows and we keep that transition fairly soft. All right, let's have a little toggle of our before and after. Now it may just be a little bit over the top. So I'm going to grab that dehaze slider, and now I can just play with the amount now that I have my mask in place, and somewhere around halfway is pretty good. Before and after, much more subtle. I like that. Okay, let's jump into the creative section. We've already done Relight AI. I don't want to swap the sky. Atmosphere AI might be nice to add a little bit of fog just around the sort of hills at the side of the lighthouse. Sun rays could also work. Now normally you obviously want to have a sun in your image, but we could set the sun rays off camera just below the lighthouse, and then work with the parameters. So we could set the sun ray warmth to match better. We could mask that in, play with penetration so that it's not actually coming through the lighthouse, etc, etc. But that's not something that I want to do in this particular photo. But it's always worth just having a play around with these tools. The dramatic filter, for instance, I like what the dramatic filter usually does for photos. However, it does start to bleach out the colors that you've introduced. And so I don't want to do that. I also don't want it really contrasty like this. It looks like a really nasty HDR photo when you do that. So I'll reduce the local contrast, have a play with the amount slider, and perhaps we do just want to have a little bit of this in our photo. Let's have a look. Here's our before, here's our after. Before and after, I'm not convinced, but we'll leave a little bit. But one of the things I do think will really benefit us is to work with a lookup table, a LUT. And so I'm just going to jump in here and we're going to apply Long Beach and see how that looks. Now, one of the things I like to do, just like with all the tools, is just push that amount all the way to 100. And then you can play with these sliders and kind of decide, do I want to be increasing contrast or reducing it? Do I want to add saturation or reduce it? And it's also easier to actually see the effect of the different LUTs as you apply them. So if I click on Geneva, I quite like this deep, rich blue that's being introduced. Obviously that is far too strong, but let's have a little play, a little toggle with this. Let's just introduce a bit of that blue. Have a look at our before and our after. Yeah, I quite like that. But one thing I really want to do is accentuate the warmth of the highlights, and a great tool for doing that is the toning tool. So as you can see, I'm just working my way down through these creative tools, asking myself whether or not I want to use them or not. And so toning, absolutely, I think this is worth playing around with. Again, push the amount slider for the saturation all the way to 100, and that's going to enable us to better see the hue that we're actually introducing as we move this through the color range. So I think we want to just stick in this nice warm orangey kind of area here, and now we can jump into the balance section and decide whether we want to just sort of keep this limited more to the highlights or whether we want it to bleed over into the shadows as well. On this occasion, I'm happy with a pretty much even 50-50 split, but one thing I don't want to do is oversaturate it. So I'm going to come back to that slider that I set all the way at 100, and now just have a little toggle left and right, using my eye to judge how much of this effect I want in. Another really nice way to introduce yellows into your highlights is to actually come into the curves tool again and just go into the blue channel, because the opposite of blue is yellow. So as we pull the blue out of the highlights, it's going to actually add the opposite of the blue, which is yellow. And if you want to balance the yellow highlights with a bit of blue, we can actually just bring that shadow point on the blues up slightly as well. And let's have a look. Here's our before, here's our after, and I feel like it might just be oversaturated. The whole photo might be just a little bit oversaturated. So I'm just going to pull the saturation down and play with it until I feel like I'm happy with it. I don't know, we don't need to go too far with that, and I feel like it's a little bit cool, so I'm just going to grab the temperature slider and bump that up a little bit. Okay, how are we looking? Here's our before, here's our after. Now, because we've applied a few tools that have enhanced the details, for example, we started with an HDR merge, which will always bring out localized detail. I've used structure AI, which has also brought in more detail. So I feel like the image, particularly in the foreground, is looking a little bit crunchy. So what I want to do is just jump into something that's going to soften that off. So you've got the glow filters, which would be appropriate, but as you guys know, I love the mystical filter. And if I push this all the way to 100, you're going to see that it adds this nice soft dreamlike quality. And with that all the way at 100, I can play around with these sliders and just get it looking the way I want it. So in terms of smoothness, I actually want to boost that up a little bit further than the default. And once I'm happy with that look, I can just ease the amount all the way back and just apply the amount that I'm happy with. Here's our before, here's our after. So let's do a quick before to what we had from our HDR merge tool and our after with our processing. Please let me know in the comments if you guys are enjoying this more freestyle approach that I'm doing here. One thing is blatantly evident to me is it's much harder for me to communicate to you while I'm doing my edit and actually remain objective, because as I'm looking at the photo now, I feel this is far too over processed for my personal aesthetic tastes. I've taken it too far. And so if you remember from Luminar AI, there used to be a handy little slider down in the bottom corner, and you could just reduce the overall effect of your process. That was really handy. So you could work on your edit, go, oh, that's too much, I like it, but it's too much. Bring it back down to about 60%, something like that. However, we still have the ability to do that in Luminar Neo, but it may not be as obvious as it used to be. So let me show you that technique, and hopefully at the end of it, I'll have something that I'm much happier with. Let's take a look. Okay, so you feel like you've gone completely overboard with your edit. Well, rather than jumping into the edits history and taking those tools back one by one, another really great way to do that is with the actual layers properties themselves. We're going to add a brand new layer, which is the original photo. By default, Luminar loads it up with a 50% opacity, so at the moment we have a 50-50 split. But if I push that back to 100, we see our original photo, and I take it back to 0, we see our processed version, and so now we have a dial to taste slider, so you can be as aggressive with that edit or as refined as you want. So for example, if we were to set this somewhere around 33%, currently we have 33% of the original showing and 67% of the edited version. That is currently our blended result, a more refined result. So if I hide that original layer, this is the process that I made, and now seeing it again, I'm like, well, that is just over the top, too much. And then I show the original photo laid over the top. That is effectively giving us the blend between those two photos and a much more refined result. So definitely keep that technique up your sleeves for when you think you've gone overboard with your edit. So from this high contrast original with little detail in the foreground or the sky, a limited color palette to the point it's almost monotone, to a more crafted and bespoke sunrise image. Now, I'm not entirely sure that I like this edit, and perhaps I should have pre-processed the photo to check that I was happy with the result before sharing, but I just wanted to freestyle it because you guys have asked for that in the past. So let me know what you thought to the video, and if you do want to see a photo that I edited in a way that I do like and want to learn some more Luminar Neo photo editing tips and tricks along the way, why don't you check out that video right there. And if you haven't subscribed already and would like to learn more from me on photo editing, you can click that button right there. I'll see you guys in the next video. See you over there. Cheers, guys. Bye-bye.